The shell screamed overhead like a wounded animal and exploded 200 yards off the port bow of USS Fanshawe Bay, sending a column of seawater higher than the carrier's mast. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague felt the shock wave punch through his chest before he heard the thunder. Salt spray hit the bridge windows. His coffee cup, which he had been holding, shattered on the deck. It was 06:58 on the morning of October 25, 1944, and Clifton Sprague had just realized he was going to die. Another salvo. 6 shells this time. They landed in a perfect bracket around the escort carrier White Plains, 3 short, 3 over. Sprague watched geysers of white water erupt from the Pacific, each one marking where a shell the size of a refrigerator had impacted. The Japanese were ranging. The next salvo would hit. Sprague's hands were shaking. He pressed them against the bridge railing to hide it from his officers. His heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his throat. Behind him, Ensign William Brooks was speaking, but the words came through like he was underwater. "Sir, radar confirms 4 capital ships, 6 heavy cruisers, multiple destroyers, range now 14 miles, and closing at 25 knots. Sprague turned and looked at Brooks. The ensign was 22 years old. He had a wife in San Diego who was 8 months pregnant. Sprague had seen the photograph on Brooks's desk 3 days ago when they were planning routine patrol schedules. 3 days ago, when everything made sense. Now, nothing made sense. Above them, at 0820, the Japanese opened fire with their main batteries. The sound was unlike anything Sprague had ever experienced. Not an explosion. A physical force that moved through the air and shook the water itself. 9 18-inch guns firing simultaneously from the battleship Yamato. Sprague had read the intelligence reports on Yamato. 72,000 tons. Armor plating up to 26 inches thick. Each shell weighed 3,200 pounds and could penetrate 16 inches of steel at 20 miles distance. The report had called Yamato unsinkable, unstoppable, the most powerful warship ever built, and Yamato was 13 miles away. Sprague grabbed the ship's radio transmitter. His voice came out steadier than he expected. "All units, Taffy 3, we are under attack by Japanese surface forces. All carriers launch all aircraft immediately. All escorts make smoke. Emergency speed, execute now." He released the transmitter button and turned to his navigation officer. "Get us into that rain squall, 3 points to starboard, flank speed." "Sir," Lieutenant Commander Robert Roberts said quietly, "flank speed is 17 knots. Those battleships are making 25. I know what our flank speed is, Commander." The bridge went silent except for the sound of shells passing overhead. Sprague could hear them now. A freight train roar that built to a shriek before impact. Each explosion sent a tremor through Fanshawe Bay's hull that he felt in his bones. He thought about his wife Helen back in Connecticut. She would get a telegram. "The Navy Department regrets to inform you." He had written her a letter yesterday morning. It was still in his pocket, unsealed, waiting for him to add something before mailing it. Now, he never would. 24 hours earlier, everything had been different. October 24th, 0615. The morning had been calm. Sprague had stood on this same bridge drinking coffee that was actually hot, watching the sunrise paint the Philippine Sea gold and orange. 6 escort carriers in perfect formation. 18 aircraft on routine patrol. The war felt far away. His operations officer, Commander Richard Fowler, had brought him breakfast on a metal tray. Powdered eggs, toast, applesauce from a can. They had talked about the invasion going well. MacArthur's forces were ashore at Leyte. The Japanese fleet had been spotted but was reportedly retreating. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet was in position to block any approach from the north. Admiral Kinkaid's 7th Fleet battleships were guarding the southern entrance to Leyte Gulf at Surigao Strait. Taffy 3 was the backup. The insurance policy. 6 escort carriers and 7 small escorts positioned off Samar Island, just in case something went wrong. Nothing was supposed to go wrong. Sprague had finished his breakfast and told Fowler that today would be boring. Routine patrols. Routine everything. Maybe they would watch movies tonight in the wardroom. There was a new John Wayne film someone had bootlegged. That was 24 hours ago. Now, at 07:07 on October 25th, the world had become fire and metal and the certainty of death. The Fanshawe Bay shuddered as her engines pushed to maximum revolutions, 17 knots. It felt like standing still. Behind her, the other 5 escort carriers of Taffy 3, Gambier Bay, Kalinin Bay, Kitkun Bay, St. Lo, and White Plains accelerated toward the rain squall 3 miles southeast. The destroyers were laying smoke. Thick chemical fog poured from canisters on their decks, mixing with black smoke from their stacks, creating an artificial cloud that drifted across the ocean. It was beautiful in a terrible way. White and black smoke intertwining, spreading, hiding the carriers as they ran. But Sprague knew it would not be enough. His radar operator called out ranges every 30 seconds. 13 miles, 12.5 miles, 12 miles. The Japanese were gaining. Every minute they closed half a mile. Sprague did the mathematics. At current speeds, the Japanese battleships would be in effective gun range, meaning they could hit consistently in approximately 18 minutes. At that point, the 6 escort carriers of Taffy 3 would be destroyed in sequence, probably in alphabetical order. He had 18 minutes to save 1,100 men. The radio crackled. Admiral Kinkaid's voice from 7th Fleet Headquarters, 60 miles south. Taffy 3, this is Kinkaid. Confirm your previous message. Did you report Japanese battleships? Sprague grabbed the handset. Affirmative. 4 battleships including Yamato. 6 heavy cruisers. We are under fire. Request immediate support. There was a long pause. When Kinkaid spoke again, his voice carried an edge of panic that Sprague had never heard from a flag officer. Jesus Christ. Where the hell is Halsey? That was the question. Where was Admiral William Halsey and his 3rd Fleet? Halsey commanded 16 fleet carriers, 6 fast battleships, 8 cruisers, and 40 destroyers. He was supposed to be guarding San Bernardino Strait, the northern passage into Leyte Gulf. But San Bernardino Strait was unguarded. The Japanese had steamed through during the night, completely unopposed, and now they were here. Sprague sent a message to Halsey at 07:24. Plain language, no encryption. Urgent priority. Task Unit 77.4.3, under attack by 4 battleships, 8 cruisers. Request fast battleships and air support immediately. Halsey did not respond. 300 miles north, Vice Admiral William Halsey stood on the bridge of his flagship USS New Jersey and watched his aircraft pummel the remnants of Japanese Admiral Ozawa's carrier force. Halsey had taken his entire fleet north during the night, chasing what he believed was the main Japanese carrier threat. He had no idea that Ozawa's carriers were nearly empty. 108 aircraft total, most of them obsolete trainers. Ozawa had been the bait, and Halsey had swallowed it completely. Now, at 07:30, while Sprague's carriers burned and men died off Samar, Halsey was destroying hollow targets 300 miles away. He would not receive Sprague's message for another 43 minutes, and when he did, his battleships would be too far north to help. Off Samar, the rain squall provided exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds of concealment. Sprague counted every second. The radar showed the Japanese ships continuing on their intercept course, their formations perfect, their speed constant. They knew where the carriers were heading. They knew the squall was temporary. When Taffy 3 emerged at 7:19, the Japanese were waiting. 13 miles south, on the bridge of battleship Yamato, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita watched the American carriers reappear from the rain squall. He allowed himself a smile. After 2 days of hell, after air attacks in the Sibuyan Sea that had sunk his flagship Otago and killed thousands of his men, after steaming through San Bernardino Strait in darkness expecting ambush at every moment, he had found them. The American carrier fleet. Kurita raised his binoculars. 6 carriers. He could see their flat flight decks. Aircraft were launching, tiny specks rising into the morning sky. These had to be fleet carriers, the big ones. Each one represented thousands of American sailors, hundreds of aircraft, enormous industrial capacity. Destroying them would cripple the American invasion of the Philippines. Kurita turned to his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi. All ships, open fire, destroy the American carriers. Koyanagi hesitated. Admiral, should we close to optimal range first? We are at extreme distance. Kurita shook his head. They are running. If we wait, they may escape. Fire now. All ships, maximum rate. The order went out across the Japanese formation. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 11 destroyers. Every gun that could bear opened fire. The sky filled with shells. On Fanshawe Bay, Sprague watched the horizon erupt with muzzle flashes. Dozens of them. He counted 9 flashes from Yamato alone. Then the flashes from the other battleships, Nagaro, Kongo, Haruna. Then the heavy cruisers. It looked like a lightning storm. Then the shells arrived. The sound hit first, a roar that built and built until it felt like the air itself was tearing apart. Then the impacts. Columns of water shot skyward, each one as tall as a 10-story building. The shell splashes formed a fence of white water around the carriers. One shell passed over Fanshawe Bay's flight deck. Sprague saw it. A dark streak moving so fast his eye could barely track it. The shell was 4 feet long and weighed more than a ton, and it missed the carrier's island superstructure by less than 50 feet. If that shell had hit, everyone on the bridge would have been vaporized. Sprague's hands were not shaking anymore. His fear had transformed into something colder. He was going to die, but he was not going to die quietly. He picked up the radio transmitter again. All destroyers and destroyer escorts, close and attack with torpedoes. There was silence on the radio. Then Commander Ernest Evans' voice came through, steady and calm. Johnston acknowledging. Commencing attack run. Sprague watched the destroyer Johnston break formation and turn south, directly toward the Japanese battleships. She was followed by destroyers Hull and Heermann, then destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond. 7 small ships charging 4 battleships. It was insane. It violated every tactical principle. Destroyers did not attack battleships. The mathematics were impossible. But those 7 captains had heard the order, and they were doing it anyway. Sprague felt something break inside his chest. Not fear anymore, something else. Pride, maybe, or grief. He was sending those men to die, and they were going willingly. At 07:16, the Japanese shells found their mark. The escort carrier Gambier Bay, trailing slightly behind the formation due to engine problems, took a direct hit from a 14-inch shell fired by battleship Kongo. The shell penetrated the carrier's thin hull, passed through the engine room, and exploded against the far bulkhead. 43 men died instantly. The explosion was so powerful it lifted the entire carrier several feet out of the water. Gambier Bay began to slow. Black smoke poured from her stack. She was wounded, falling behind, becoming the straggler that Japanese doctrine said to kill first. On Fanshawe Bay's bridge, Sprague watched Gambier Bay take hit after hit. Shell splashes walked up her length, then direct impacts. Her flight deck erupted in orange flame. Her hull opened to the sea. He could not help her. He had no weapons that could reach 13 miles. All he could do was watch. The destroyers were closing now. Johnston led the charge, her wake cutting white across the Pacific as she accelerated to 35 knots. Japanese cruisers shifted fire to the attacking destroyers. 8-inch shells began falling around Johnston like hail. One shell hit her bridge. The explosion killed 11 men and wounded Commander Evans, but the destroyer kept coming. At 6,000 yards, Johnston fired her torpedoes. 10 white trails raced toward the Japanese formation at 46 knots. One struck the heavy cruiser Kumano in the bow, blowing off 40 feet of the ship's front section. Kumano immediately lost speed, falling out of formation, her bow destroyed and flooding. A 2,000-ton destroyer had just crippled a 13,000-ton cruiser, but the cost came immediately. Every Japanese gun within range opened fire on Johnston. The destroyer disappeared into a storm of shell splashes. At 07:30, Gambier Bay's captain gave the order to abandon ship. Men jumped from the tilting flight deck into the Pacific. Life rafts deployed. The carrier was dying. Sprague stood on Fanshawe Bay's bridge and watched 600 men go into the water. Some of them were swimming. Some were clinging to wreckage. Some were not moving. He thought about Helen's letter in his pocket. He thought about his 2 daughters, ages 7 and 9. He thought about all the letters he would never write. Then he picked up the radio transmitter one more time. All aircraft, all carriers. Attack the Japanese battleships with whatever weapons you have. I don't care if it's torpedoes, bombs, or your bare hands. Stop them. And in the sky above the battle, something impossible began to happen. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita thought he saw a dead man standing on the bridge of Yamato. The figure stood near the radar console, water dripping from his uniform, face blackened by fuel oil. Kurita blinked hard, and the figure disappeared. He had not slept in 48 hours. The hallucinations were becoming more frequent. 2 days ago, American submarines had torpedoed his flagship Atago. Kurita had been on the bridge when the torpedo struck, the explosion lifting the entire ship sideways, throwing him against the bulkhead. He remembered the water rushing in, cold and black, dragging men down into the depths. He remembered swimming through burning oil, the smell of it filling his lungs, watching sailors scream as the flames consumed them. 600 men had died in 11 minutes. Kurita had survived by swimming away from the burning oil toward clear water, while men around him drowned or burned alive. Their screams still echoed in his ears every time he closed his eyes. Now he stood on the bridge of the largest battleship ever built, his uniform stiff with dried salt, his hands trembling from exhaustion, and watched the sun rise over the Philippine Sea. The smell of cordite and oil and sweat filled the enclosed bridge space. His mouth tasted like copper. He had bitten his tongue during an air attack yesterday, and the wound kept reopening. At 06:44, the lookout's voice cracked through the bridge intercom. Multiple contacts bearing 085 degrees. Distance 18 miles. Flat decks. Count 6 large vessels. Kurita grabbed his binoculars and moved to the observation platform. His hands were shaking so badly he had to brace the binoculars against the railing. He focused on the horizon and saw them. 6 flat-topped ships. Aircraft carriers. His heart began hammering in his chest. The sound filled his ears, drowning out everything else. These were not transports. These were carriers. American fleet carriers. He had found them. Rear Admiral Tomoji Koyanagi appeared beside him, also looking through binoculars. "Admiral, those are carriers. Should we continue to Leyte Gulf or engage?" Kurita's mind raced. His orders were clear. Proceed to Leyte Gulf and destroy the American invasion transports. But carriers were strategic targets. Every carrier he sank would delay American offensive operations by months, and there were 6 of them right in front of him. More importantly, if he sank American carriers, the Emperor himself would hear his name. The shame of losing Otago would be erased. The families of the 600 dead sailors would know their sacrifice had meaning. His father's voice echoed in his memory. A samurai who fails his mission must not return home. Better to die with honor than live with shame. "All ships," Kurita said, his voice steadier than his hands. "Attack formation. Target the American carriers. Maximum speed. Destroy them all." The order flashed across the fleet. On Yamato's bridge, officers moved to their stations with practiced efficiency. Below decks, gun crews ran to their posts. The massive 18-inch guns, each barrel longer than a truck, began training toward the distant American ships. Kurita watched the American carriers through his binoculars. They were turning away, launching aircraft. Good seamanship. But they were slow, maybe 15 knots. His battleships could make 26 knots. He would overtake them within the hour, fire when in range. At 06:58, the heavy cruisers opened fire. 8-inch guns barked in sequence, the sound rolling across the water like thunder. Kurita watched the shells arc through the morning sky, tiny black dots against the blue, and impact 200 yards behind the nearest American carrier. Close. Very close. Then something unexpected happened. The American formation did not scatter. Instead, they turned into a rain squall while their escort ships began generating smoke. Thick white and black clouds poured across the ocean, hiding the carriers. That was good tactics. Disciplined, professional. Then Kurita saw something that made his stomach clench. 7 American escort ships were turning south, toward his battleships. They were attacking. "Destroyers are attacking us," Koyanagi said, his voice carrying disbelief. "They are charging battleships." Kurita watched the small American ships accelerate, their wakes bright white against the dark Pacific. It made no tactical sense. His battleships had 18-inch guns with a range of 26 miles. Those destroyers had 5-inch guns with a range of 10 miles. They would be destroyed long before they could fire a shot, unless they had torpedoes. The memory hit him like a physical blow, Otago sinking. The torpedo explosion, the screaming, water rushing in, men drowning in darkness. All ships, evasive maneuvers. Watch for torpedoes, heavy cruisers, engage those destroyers immediately. The lead American destroyer, hull number 557, was closing at incredible speed, 35 knots, maybe more. The Japanese heavy cruisers opened fire. 8-inch shells began falling around the charging destroyer in massive waterspouts. The American ship disappeared into the splash patterns, then emerged, still coming. Kurita had never seen anything like this. He had fought at Midway. He had commanded ships at Guadalcanal. He had survived 2 years of brutal combat in the Pacific. Destroyers did not attack battleships. It was suicide. But these Americans were doing it anyway. At 07:16, the lead destroyer reached 6,000 yards. Kurita watched white torpedo trails appear in the water, 10 of them, racing toward his heavy cruisers at 46 knots. Heavy cruiser Kumano attempted to turn. Too slow. The torpedo struck her bow, and the explosion tore off the entire forward section of the ship. 40 feet of steel and machinery simply gone. Kumano immediately began listing, black smoke pouring from her ruptured hull. A 2,000-ton destroyer had just crippled one of his 13,000-ton heavy cruisers. Kurita tasted bile in his throat. His hands gripped the railing so hard his knuckles turned white. The smell of his own sweat mixed with the cordite smoke drifting across Yamato's bridge. This was not how the battle was supposed to develop. At 07:24, American aircraft arrived. Kurita expected torpedo bombers, dive bombers, coordinated strikes. Instead, he saw fighters making strafing runs with just machine guns. 50 caliber rounds sparked off Yamato's armored deck, causing no damage but forcing gun crews to take cover. The pilots were attacking with machine guns. No bombs, no torpedoes. That meant these carriers had no ordnance left. Or these were not fleet carriers at all. "Koyanagi," Kurita said, his voice tight. "How big are those carriers? Give me an estimate." Koyanagi raised his binoculars and studied the American ships through gaps in the smoke. "Admiral, I see flat decks, but the hulls appear small, perhaps 10,000 tons. Not fleet carriers? These may be escort carriers." The words hit Kurita like cold water. Escort carriers. CVEs. Small converted merchant ships used for anti-submarine work and air support. Each one carried maybe 20 aircraft. They were not strategic targets. They were support vessels, which meant the real American fleet was somewhere else. The realization crashed over him like a wave. His vision blurred at the edges. The bridge seemed to tilt. He grabbed the railing to keep from falling. He had been deceived. These 6 carriers were not Halsey's main fleet. They were bait. Just like Admiral Ozawa's empty carriers had been bait to draw Halsey north. Both sides had used decoys. Both sides had fallen for it. The Americans had played him for a fool. Kurita's stomach twisted. He tasted copper and bile. His father's voice again, clear as if the old man stood beside him. A samurai who fails through stupidity brings dishonor to his family for 7 generations. He thought of his wife Chiyoko in Tokyo. She would receive a telegram. "Your husband has disgraced the Imperial Navy." She would have to bow and apologize to neighbors. His daughters would never find honorable marriages. His family name would become associated with failure and shame. The traditional response would be seppuku, ritual suicide to restore honor. A blade across the stomach, the pain lasting for minutes while blood pooled on white cloth. But dead men could not complete missions. Dead men could not redeem themselves. An officer ran onto the bridge, his face pale. "Admiral, radio intelligence reports American transmissions requesting support from Admiral Halsey. The transmissions indicate Halsey is 300 miles north." 300 miles. That meant Halsey could not reach this battle for at least 6 hours. Kurita still had time. He could still sink these escort carriers and reach Lady Gulf, but the Americans were fighting like demons. At 08:11, another American destroyer, already on fire from multiple hits, charged toward Battleship Congo and fired torpedoes at point-blank range. The torpedoes forced Congo to turn away, breaking formation. The burning American destroyer then tried to escape, but Japanese cruisers surrounded her and pounded her to pieces. But before she sank, she had disrupted Kurita's battle line. At 08:30, another American escort destroyer, a tiny 1,300-ton ship, had somehow crippled heavy cruiser Chokai with repeated 5-inch gun hits. The cruiser was dead in the water, burning. The Americans were not running anymore. They were fighting with a ferocity that defied logic and mathematics and tactical sense. Kurita stood on Yamato's bridge and tried to understand. His fleet had been chasing 6 escort carriers for 90 minutes. He had sunk 1 carrier and damaged several destroyers, but he had lost or crippled 4 heavy cruisers. His fleet was scattered across 30 miles of ocean. His fuel was running low, and the American carriers were still fighting. More American planes appeared. These had bombs and torpedoes, but they attacked individually, not in coordinated waves. Some pilots made dry runs, diving without releasing weapons, just to force Japanese ships to maneuver and waste time. Other pilots, after expending their ordnance, came back and made strafing runs until their ammunition was gone. One pilot, Kurita watched him, had no ammunition left but kept making mock attack runs on heavy cruiser tone, diving as if to crash into her bridge, forcing the cruiser to take evasive action. The Americans were attacking with nothing but courage. Kurita felt something break inside him, not fear, something deeper. These enemy sailors, these Americans he had been taught to despise as soft and weak and corrupted by luxury, were fighting with a spirit he had only seen in samurai. They were willing to die to buy time for their carriers. They were sacrificing themselves without hesitation. That was Bushido. That was the warrior code. And if they were willing to die for 6 escort carriers, what were they protecting? The thought hit him like a second torpedo. This was a trap. The Americans were not fighting desperately to save these carriers. They were fighting to keep him here, to delay him, to waste his time and fuel while something else moved into position. Halsey's real fleet. The big carriers. They could be heading toward him right now. He had no reconnaissance aircraft. No way to see beyond 10 miles through this smoke and chaos. He was fighting blind. At Aero 911, Kurita looked at his watch and did the mathematics. 2 hours of high-speed steaming, 4 heavy cruisers crippled or sunk, his fleet scattered and disorganized, fuel running low, and he was no closer to Leyte Gulf. The invasion transports were 60 miles southwest. If he turned toward them now, he could be bombarding the beaches by noon. He could still complete his original mission. But the ferocity of this American defense told him something was wrong. These men were dying to keep him here. That meant they knew something he did not. That meant this was a delaying action. That meant he was sailing into an ambush. Koyanagi appeared at his side. "Admiral, fuel is becoming critical. Some destroyers report less than 40% capacity." Kurita nodded. He looked at the smoke-covered horizon. His hands had stopped shaking. The fear had transformed into something colder. Certainty. If he continued toward Leyte Gulf, he would arrive with a scattered, disorganized fleet low on fuel. And then Halsey's carriers would arrive and destroy him. Every ship, every man, just like at Midway. If he continued this chase, these Americans would delay him until Halsey arrived. Then it would be Yamato at the bottom of the ocean. Kurita swimming through burning oil again. Except this time he would not survive. His father's voice one more time. A samurai must know when to advance and when to withdraw. Wisdom is knowing the difference. At Aero 9-17, an American escort carrier appeared through a gap in the smoke, 4 miles away. She was damaged, trailing smoke, limping. One salvo would sink her. Kurita could see men on her flight deck trying to launch aircraft. He opened his mouth to give the order to fire, then he closed it. The image of Atago sinking filled his vision. 600 men screaming as they died. If he led this fleet into a trap, it would not be 600. It would be 10,000, 20,000. The entire fleet. A samurai who throws away his men's lives for pride is not brave. He is a murderer. "All ships," Kurita said quietly. "Cease fire, discontinue the attack, reform, and withdraw to the north." The bridge went silent. Every officer stared at him. Koyanagi's face went pale. "Sir, the enemy carriers are within range. We can sink them all." "No." Kurita's voice was hard. "This is a trap. The Americans are sacrificing these ships to keep us here while their main fleet moves to surround us. I will not lead these men into an ambush. We withdraw. Now." He turned to face his officers. His voice did not waver. "If I am wrong, I will take full responsibility. I will accept whatever judgment the Emperor decrees, but I will not watch another 10,000 men drown because I was too proud to recognize a trap. We withdraw. The order went out. Across the Japanese fleet, commanders stared at their radios in disbelief. They were winning. The Americans were damaged and vulnerable. But orders were orders. The Japanese battleships, cruisers, and destroyers turned away from the fleeing American carriers and headed north. On USS Fanshawe Bay, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague watched through binoculars as the Japanese fleet turned away. He did not believe it. He thought it was a maneuver. But they kept turning, kept increasing distance. They were leaving. Sprague sat down in his command chair. His legs would not hold him anymore. "They are running," he whispered. "Jesus Christ, they are actually running." His communications officer looked up. "Sir, should we pursue?" Sprague started laughing. The exhausted, slightly hysterical laughter of a man who had been certain he would die and somehow survived. "Pursue? Lieutenant, we have 2 carriers damaged, 4 destroyers sunk or sinking, aircraft held together with tape and prayer, and crews who have not slept in 30 hours. We are not pursuing anyone. We are going to sit right here and thank God we are still breathing." The bridge erupted in cheers. Men hugged each other. Some cried, some just sat down on the deck and stared at nothing. Sprague pulled out the letter to his wife, Helen, that he had been carrying in his pocket. He would finish it tonight. He would tell her about this day. He would try to explain how they had survived when every law of mathematics and tactics said they should have died. He would try to explain how 7 destroyers had charged 4 battleships, how pilots had attacked with empty guns, how men had fought until their ships sank beneath them. He would try, but he suspected no one would believe him. At 10:47, Ensign William Brooks was still at his radar station, monitoring the sky, when he saw something that made his blood freeze. "Sir," he said quietly, "I have a single contact inbound from the north. High speed. It is not maneuvering like a normal aircraft." Sprague grabbed his binoculars and looked north. He saw it. A single aircraft, coming in low and fast over the water, heading directly for the carriers. But it was flying wrong. The nose was pointed down. The trajectory was too steep. It was not attacking. It was diving, deliberately. "Oh, God," Sprague whispered. "Kamikaze." The aircraft slammed into escort carrier St. Lo at 10:53. The explosion tore through her flight deck, detonating bombs and torpedoes in the hangar bay. Secondary explosions ripped the carrier apart from the inside. She sank in 30 minutes. The Japanese had introduced a new weapon. Pilots who turned themselves into guided missiles. Men who chose death as their attack method. And in 30 minutes, one kamikaze pilot killed more Americans than Admiral Kurita's entire battleship fleet had managed in over 2 hours. Gunner's mate 3rd class, Paul Henry Carr, was 24 years old when he died, holding a 54-pound artillery shell in his arms like a newborn child. He had been born in Chakotah, Oklahoma, population 873. His mother, Edna, worked at the general store. His father, Henry, fixed tractors. Paul had joined the Navy 2 days after his 18th birthday because there were no jobs in Chakotah and he wanted to send money home to help his younger sister Mary finish high school. Now, at 09:35 on October 25, 1944, Paul Carr lay in the wreckage of Gunmount No. 2 aboard the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts. His legs were gone below the knees, blown off when a 14-inch shell from a Japanese battleship had penetrated the thin armor of the gun mount and exploded. Shrapnel had torn through his stomach and chest. Blood pooled beneath him, mixing with hydraulic fluid and spent shell casings. The gun barrel above him glowed cherry red. In 35 minutes, Carr and his crew had fired 324 rounds at Japanese heavy cruisers. The barrel had overheated. The breech mechanism had failed. The final shell had exploded inside the chamber, killing 4 men instantly and mortally, wounding Carr. But Carr was still conscious, still at his station, and he was holding one last shell, begging the damage control party to help him load it into the damaged breech. Lieutenant Robert Roberts, the Samuel B. Roberts's gunnery officer, knelt beside Carr in the blood and oil. The smell of burned flesh and cordite filled the ruined gun mount. Carr's eyes were unfocused, but his hands gripped the shell with terrible strength. "Sir," Carr whispered, his voice barely audible over the sounds of explosions and rushing water. "We need to fire this round. The Japs are still out there. We need to keep firing." Roberts put his hand on Carr's shoulder. The young gunner's mate was dying. His entire lower body was destroyed, but his mind was still fighting. "Paul," Roberts said quietly, "the gun is destroyed. We cannot fire anymore. The ship is sinking. We have to evacuate." Carr shook his head weakly. His fingers tightened on the shell. "No, sir. One more round, just one more. We can hit them. We can keep the carriers safe. Just help me load it, please." Roberts felt tears running down his face. Around them, the Samuel B. Roberts was breaking apart. A massive hole had been torn in her port side by Japanese shells. Both engine rooms were flooded. The ship was listing 30 degrees and settling by the stern. Water was pouring in through dozens of holes. The captain had given the order to abandon ship 3 minutes ago. "Paul, we have to go now. The ship is going down." Carr's eyes focused on Roberts for a moment. There was no fear in them, only determination and something that looked like sadness. "Did we save them, sir? Did the carriers get away?" "Yes, Paul, you saved them. All of you. You stopped the Japanese battleships. The carriers are safe." Carr smiled. Blood ran from the corner of his mouth. "Good," he whispered. "That is good." His grip on the shell relaxed, his eyes closed. "Gunners, mate 3rd class. Paul Henry." Carr died at his station, holding his last round, having fired more shells in 35 minutes than his gun mount was designed to fire in an hour. Roberts gently pried the shell from Carr's dead hands and set it down. Then he climbed out of the wrecked gun mount and into the chaos of a ship dying beneath him. Men were jumping from the tilting deck into the Pacific. Life rafts were deploying. The Samuel B. Roberts's bow was rising as her stern sank deeper. She would be gone in minutes. Roberts jumped into the water at 09:45. The ocean was warm, almost body temperature, but it was covered with a layer of fuel oil 2 inches thick. The oil coated his skin, filled his nose and mouth, made it almost impossible to breathe. He swam away from the sinking ship, away from the suction that would drag him down when she went under. At 09:50, the Samuel B. Roberts rolled onto her side and slid beneath the surface. Roberts floated in the oil-covered water and watched his ship disappear. Around him, 224 men from the Samuel B. Roberts crew were in the water. 90 men had died during the battle or gone down with the ship. The survivors clung to life rafts and floating debris. Some were wounded, some were burned. All were covered in thick black fuel oil that stung their eyes and filled their lungs. And then the sharks came. Seaman First Class Robert Billy was 19 years old. He had grown up in Corpus Christi, Texas, where his father owned a fishing boat. Billy knew the ocean. He knew what circled beneath them. The first shark took fireman Second Class James Martinez at 11:20. Martinez had been wounded during the battle, a piece of shrapnel in his thigh. He had been bleeding into the water for over an hour. The shark struck from below, dragging Martinez under in a swirl of red foam. He never surfaced. The men on the life rafts pulled their legs out of the water. Those floating without rafts clustered together, kicking and splashing to scare the sharks away. It did not work. The sharks were drawn by blood and the vibrations of hundreds of men thrashing in the water. Over the next 6 hours, the sharks took 11 more men. Billy watched it happen. He watched men disappear beneath the surface, sometimes silently, sometimes screaming. He watched the water turn red. He smelled the blood mixing with the fuel oil. He felt his own terror become a physical thing, a cold weight in his chest that made it hard to breathe. At 1540, a Japanese destroyer appeared on the horizon. The survivors watched it approach with a mixture of hope and fear. Would the Japanese rescue them, or would they be shot in the water? The destroyer stopped 500 yards away. Japanese sailors lined the rails, looking down at the American survivors floating in the oil slick. Then the destroyer's machine guns opened fire. Bullets tore through the water, kicking up spray. Men screamed. Some dove under the surface. Others tried to swim away. The firing lasted for 37 seconds. Then the Japanese destroyer turned and steamed away, leaving behind 12 more dead Americans floating face down in the oil. Billy survived because he had been on the far side of a floating piece of debris when the firing started. The debris took the bullets meant for him. When the shooting stopped and he looked around, he saw bodies everywhere. Men he had served with for 2 years. Men he had eaten with, slept beside, played cards with. Dead. He vomited into the oil slick and kept floating. The rescue came at 17:15, more than 7 hours after the Samuel B. Roberts sank. The destroyer escort USS Dennis found the survivors and began pulling them from the water. Billy was hauled aboard by 2 sailors who had to pry his oil-covered fingers from the rope ladder. His hands would not unclench. They had been gripping floating debris for so long that the muscles had locked. On the Dennis's deck, Billy collapsed. A corpsman tried to examine him, but Billy pushed him away and crawled to the railing. He looked out at the water where men were still being pulled from the oil. Some were alive, some were not. Billy was still at that railing 3 hours later when the Dennis finished rescue operations and turned toward Leyte Gulf. He never left the rail. He just stared at the empty ocean where his ship had been. 400 miles north, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of Yamato and watched the sunset over the Philippine Sea. His fleet was heading northwest, away from Leyte Gulf, away from the battle, away from the mission he had failed to complete. The bridge was silent. No one spoke. No one looked at Kurita. The shame was a physical presence, thick and suffocating. Kurita's hands were steady now. The trembling had stopped hours ago. He had made his decision and there was no taking it back. He had retreated from 6 escort carriers and a handful of destroyers. He had turned the most powerful battleship in the world away from a battle he could have won. History would judge him. He knew that. His name would be forever associated with failure and cowardice. But 10,000 of his men were still alive because of his decision. That had to count for something. At 19:30, Kurita retired to his cabin. He sat at his desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. He wrote a letter to his wife, Chiyoko. He told her about the battle. He told her about the American destroyers that charged battleships. He told her about the pilots who attacked with empty guns. He told her that he had retreated because the alternative was leading his men into certain death. He told her that he was prepared to accept whatever punishment the emperor decreed. If that punishment was death, he was ready. But he would not apologize for choosing to save his men rather than throw them away for glory. Kurita sealed the letter and set it aside. Then he opened his desk drawer and looked at the ceremonial knife that every Japanese naval officer carried. The blade was 18 inches long, perfectly sharp, wrapped in white silk. He picked up the knife and held it for a long time. The traditional response to failure was seppuku, ritual suicide to restore honor. But Kurita thought about his wife and his daughters. He thought about the 10,000 men still alive on his ships. He thought about Paul Carr dying at his gun, about the American destroyers charging into certain death, about courage that had nothing to do with victory. He put the knife back in the drawer and closed it. 2 weeks later, on November 8, 1944, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita was relieved of command and recalled to Tokyo. He was interrogated by the Naval General Staff for 3 days. They asked him why he had retreated, why he had failed to destroy the American carriers, why he had not completed his mission. Kurita answered every question honestly. He said he had believed he was sailing into a trap. He said he had chosen to preserve his fleet rather than sacrifice it for a tactical victory that would not change the strategic situation. He said he had acted in the best interest of the Imperial Navy. The interrogators were not satisfied, but they did not order his execution. Instead, they assigned him to a desk job in Tokyo, effectively ending his career. Kurita spent the rest of the war pushing papers and watching Japan slowly lose. He survived the war. He lived until 1977, dying at age 77 in a hospital in Tokyo. He never spoke publicly about the battle off Samar. When journalists asked him about it, he would say only that he had done what he thought was right and would make the same decision again. In his final years, a young naval historian visited Kurita at his home. The historian asked him if he had any regrets about turning away from the American carriers. Kurita looked out his window at the Tokyo skyline, rebuilt from the ashes of the war. "I regret that so many men died that day," Kurita said quietly. "American men and Japanese men. I regret that the war happened at all, but do I regret my decision to retreat? No. I saw courage that day that I had never witnessed before. American sailors fighting with a spirit that rivaled our own Bushido. They were willing to die to protect their carriers. And I realized that if they were willing to make that sacrifice, there must be something waiting behind them that justified it. I was not going to lead my men into that trap. I chose life over glory. History may call me a coward. I can live with that." On November 3, 1944, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague sat in his quarters aboard the Fanshawe Bay and wrote letters to the families of the men who had died in the battle off Samar. He had 173 letters to write, one for each man lost from the ships under his command. He had been writing for 6 hours. His hand cramped. His eyes burned. But he kept writing because these families deserved more than a form letter from the Navy Department. He picked up the next file. Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, age 24. Next of kin, Mother Edna Carr, Chakotah, Oklahoma. Sprague read the report from Lieutenant Roberts about how Carr had died, about the last round, about refusing to leave his station, about asking if the carriers had been saved. Sprague put his head in his hands and cried. He had been holding it together for 9 days, but this broke him. He cried for Paul Carr. He cried for all the young men who had died protecting his carriers. He cried for the impossibility of explaining their sacrifice to mothers and fathers and wives who would never understand why their sons and husbands were gone. After 10 minutes, he wiped his face and picked up his pen. "Dear Mrs. Carr, it is my painful duty to inform you that your son, Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, was killed in action on October 25, 1944, during the battle off Samar. I cannot find words adequate to express what your son did that day. He and his shipmates faced overwhelming odds and fought with courage that exceeded anything I have witnessed in 30 years of naval service. When his ship was under attack by Japanese battleships, your son remained at his gun and fired over 300 rounds at the enemy. When his gun was destroyed and he was mortally wounded, he asked only if we had saved the carriers he was protecting. Because of men like your son, we did save those carriers. Because of his sacrifice and the sacrifice of his shipmates, the Japanese fleet was turned away, and the invasion of the Philippines succeeded. Your son died a hero. That word is used too often and has lost its meaning, but in Paul's case it is the only word that fits. He gave his life to save others. He died doing his duty. He never wavered. He never quit. I am so deeply sorry for your loss. Please know that your son's courage inspired every man who witnessed it. His memory will live on in the hearts of all who served with him. With deepest sympathy, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague sealed the letter and set it aside. Then he picked up the next file. He had 172 more letters to write. 50 years later, on October 25, 1994, Robert Billy stood on the deck of a chartered boat floating over the spot where the USS Samuel B. Roberts had sunk. He was 69 years old now. His hair was white. His hands shook from Parkinson's disease. But he had traveled from Texas to the Philippines to be here on the 50th anniversary of the battle. Around him were 32 other survivors from Taffy 3. Men who had served on the Johnston, the Hole, the Gambier Bay. Old men now, some in wheelchairs, some on oxygen. But they had all come back to this place. A Navy chaplain said a prayer. Then the survivors, one by one, dropped wreaths into the water. Flowers floating on the Pacific, marking the graves of ships and men long gone. When it was Billy's turn, he stood at the rail, holding his wreath. He looked down at the water, clear and blue and peaceful. Nothing like the oil-covered nightmare of 50 years ago. He thought about Paul Carr and his last round, about Commander Evans going down with the Johnston, about James Martinez taken by sharks, about all the men who had died that day so that others could live. Billy dropped his wreath into the water and watched it float away. Then he whispered words that no one else could hear. We saved them. The carriers got away. You did not die for nothing. I promise you that. I have told your story for 50 years, and I will tell it until I die. The world will remember what you did. The wreath drifted on the current, moving slowly away from the boat, out toward the open ocean where 6 escort carriers had once run for their lives, while destroyers charged battleships, and men died at their guns, holding rounds they would never fire. And far below, in the darkness where sunlight never reaches, the wrecks of those ships rested on the ocean floor. Silent, forgotten by the world, but not by the men who survived them.